I'm coming to you from the stage of Strong Auditorium at the University of Rochester. In fact, it's February the 9th, 2014, just before we do a show here, a special 50th anniversary of the Beatles on Ed Sullivan here with a local group that I play with here, the Smooth Talkers, and a number of faculty and students from my department. So while we've got all the gear set up, I thought this might be a fun time to kind of show you some of the Beatles gear that I use when I play this stuff that's pretty close to what George and some of the other Beatles used in the early years. We're really focusing more on the early stuff than on the later stuff. So the guitar you see me holding right now is a guitar that's very similar in design to the guitar that George played on the Ed Sullivan Show, that first performance on February the 9th. The one that I'm playing is a little bit changed from the one that George played in that it has actual F-holes here instead of painted on F-holes, which are what George has had. He had a couple of mutes here that muted the strings here. That on the back of it, there was a rubber pad that kind of kept the belt from making any kind of scratches, and the guitar and the neck joined each other at a slightly different place. This guitar is a kind of a modern redesign of that guitar that he played, and is a lot more practical in a lot of kind of guitar-y kinds of ways. So this one here, this is the Gretsch Country Gentleman, this one called the Country Classic, a guitar that George played like this on the Ed Sullivan Show. The guitar I'm holding now is a replica of the Rickenbacker electric 12-string that George Harrison got the weekend they were in New York for that first Ed Sullivan Show given to him by the people at Rickenbacker. The guitar that George got was only the second electric 12-string that Rickenbacker had ever made. It was a kind of a prototype guitar. This one is a very close replica. Only Rickenbacker fanatics would know the difference between this one, which is a V64, and the closer replica, which is a C63. The interesting thing about this guitar is when you play it, it's got a very big, full kind of sound. And you see that when you look at it straight on, you see the six tuning pegs, 3 on each side. But if I turn it sideways, you can see the other 6 are there. And so looked at without looking at it too carefully, you might think it was just a regular 6-string guitar, but in fact it's a 12-string guitar. That's exactly the story that Roger McGuinn tells when he talks about having seen A Hard Day's Night and noticed that George was playing one of these guitars, and it ended up being Roger McGuinn's, a guitar something like this, very similar to this, ended up being the signature guitar that Roger McGuinn has played throughout his entire career. George played this all through A Hard Day's Night and then a couple of albums later on 1 or 2 tunes. I'm now holding a Gretsch Tennessean guitar, or the modern reproduction of the Gretsch Tennessean. It's called the Tennessee Rose. This one's a little bit different from the other Gretsch that you saw. Not only is the body design a little bit different, but the actual pickups in it are of a different kind than are in the Country Gentleman reissue that I played for you. And they're a lot more trebly, like a Fender guitar. So. Guitar's got an awful lot of snap. This guitar is most often associated with the album Beatles for Sale. So in those concert pictures you see the Beatles in late 1964 and early 1965. George plays it a lot in the Help movie as well, and in those scenes you see this one. His was redder than mine. Mine's a little bit more of a walnut color, but nevertheless, both this guitar and the other guitar, the other Gretsch guitar, very much associated with country guitarist Chet Atkins, whose sort of finger-picking style. Very associated with these guitars. George Harrison, a big fan of Chet Atkins, like a lot of people around Liverpool were when he was growing up. And so that may have motivated his choice for Chet Atkins endorsed guitars from Gretsch. I'm now holding one of the most iconic of Beatle guitars. This is the Hofner bass, often called the violin bass or the Beatle bass, that Paul McCartney made so famous and stuck with through a lot of his career with the Beatles, though he also used a Rickenbacker bass. This bass is interesting because the scale of, in other words, the length of the strings is a little bit shorter than on other bass guitars. So it's a little bit of a shorter scale guitar, kind of like John Lennon's Rickenbacker was a shorter scale Rickenbacker as well. And the guitar is completely hollow, so you wouldn't believe how light it is. It's very moves very sort of easily, unlike a lot of bass guitars, solid body guitars that are kind of heavy. And Paul would sometimes play with his fingers, but a lot of times he would play with a pick. So the sound of the guitar itself, the bass, is really kind of round. Some people might say a very dark sound. But that's lightened a little bit by the use of the pick to create that articulation. See, if I play with my fingers, it's an even rounder sound. Of course, Paul played his guitar left-handed, so this, of course, is a right-handed guitar. I have, because I play right-handed. But anyway, here it is, the Hofner Beatle bass. So I'm now standing by my Vox AC30 amplifier with the the Beatles recreation amplifier stand that would have been the one that they used back in 1964. This amp, 30-watt amp with two 12-inch speakers behind here, by today's standards is a really loud amp. The way I'm playing it tonight at this show, I've got it turned way down, but you can see that's because we mic the amps, and it all goes through the PA system, so the stage volume tends to be relatively quiet when we perform. But back in the day when the Beatles were touring, these amps weren't loud enough, and they complained to Vox that they needed bigger amps with more power because they weren't doing as much miking. The PA systems that they played through weren't as sophisticated, and they had to depend actually on amp volume to fill these larger venues that they were playing. So they hoped that they could get Vox to get them an amp that had more than just 30 watts. They had a 50-watt one and a 100-watt one, and so they used these amps at the very beginning, but quickly abandoned them for bigger amps because they needed those for some of the bigger venues they were playing. But anyway, this amp now considered a real classic amp, and the best one if you want to get that 60s sound to put together with your Gretsch or your Rickenbacker to really nail that 1964-65 British Invasion sound. So I'm standing over here by my guitar arsenal with some of the other guitars that I use when we do these Beatles shows, and I've got more guitars here than the Beatles would typically have brought to a show in 64, 65, or 66 when they were touring. Be enough for George Harrison to have two guitars with him, maybe a 6-string, a 12-string, and maybe a backup 6-string, but that would have been it. We're doing stuff from different parts of their career, so we've got different instruments here. And besides that, I'm a bit of a guitar crazoid, so I just love to have lots of guitars. But this one I'm going to show you here, this is not really a Beatles guitar, and I use it on things like Norwegian wood when I have to get the sitar sound. This guitar, a guitar like this was originally made by the Dan Electro Company in the 60s, and this is a reproduction of that guitar. It's got a special vibrating piece down here that makes the strings vibrate so that people say, what do these strings do here? Well, they're supposed to resonate sympathetically like a synthesizer, like a sitar strings would, but it doesn't ever really work. So all you can really do with these things is every now and again you play something and you reach up here and go, and that's what you get. Let me show you one other thing that we have here, that I have here for the show, and that is for the pieces that require acoustic guitar. I have this Gibson J165 guitar. I really like this guitar. It's an awful lot like the big guitar that the J200 that George played, especially toward the end of the group's career. It's a smaller body guitar, but you know, you have to have a guitar to do some of the acoustic things. I'm using this one tonight for Here Comes the Sun. It's got a pickup that's built into it. We've got a little device on the floor, a direct box that takes it directly into the PA, and so it's a very convenient way of getting some of those acoustic sounds when you need them. So here I am, standing here with the setup for tonight's show. So I hope you've enjoyed looking through these instruments a little bit and sort of seeing some of the instruments that musicians use today to try to get some of the sounds that the Beatles got some 50 years ago. But for now, I'm going to have to sign off because the show's starting any minute. I got to get backstage and hang with the band.